Welcome back to HQ Spotlight. You want to take a shot on some long shots? Well, how about the longest shots to win the Super Bowl? The Giants and the Titans are tied for the longest odds at plus 20,000. At least the Titans have a quarterback. Jets currently sit at plus 15,000 with Justin Fields signed under center. They're tied with the Panthers, followed by the Browns, the Saints, and the Raiders, while the Colts are priced at plus 8,500. Still a long shot, but a little bit more manageable. And with that, let's get an NFL writer for CBSSports.com, Tyler Sullivan. Sully, a lot of moves have been made in free agency, but the jury is still out on just how impactful those moves will be, particularly when we look at some of these playoff hopefuls. So let's start with the Seahawks and Sam Darnold. Darnold, coming off his best season with the Vikings, had a lot of us thinking maybe we misjudged him. Maybe he just needed to be in a good system until the last two games of this season. Given what we know about Sam Darnold, are the Seahawks a playoff contender?
I don't think so. And they have probably made the biggest splash so far in free agency. Again, when you sign a quarterback to over $100 million deal, that's going to make some waves. I just don't know if those waves are going to have them sail all the way to the playoffs, just because I'm concerned about, as you referenced, what we saw at the end of the year with Sam Darnold. I kind of feel like that's a little bit more than who he is, as opposed to what we saw during the year. Not to try to take anything away from him. Tremendous year. Over 4,000 yards passing, 35 passing touchdowns. Very good for the Minnesota Vikings. But the thing about the Minnesota Vikings is that they're the perfect situation pretty much for any quarterback right now. Good offensive line, great wide receivers, especially Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, a good backfield, great defense, unbelievable coaching staff. He now goes to Seattle. It's a worse coaching staff in my estimation, a worse offensive line, worse weapons because they just traded away DK Metcalf, JSN, great, but that's really it, and a worse defense. And you're in a division now, when you talk about that playoff game against the Los Angeles Rams, you're now in that division with Sean McVay, and he just prevented you from scoring double-digit points in the playoffs. So I don't think that Sean McVay is really, staying up at night saying that Sam Darnold's in his division. So I don't think that this is going to be that impactful in terms of the playoffs for Seattle.
You just eviscerated him on that one, and honestly, no notes, Sully. Agree with you completely. One quarterback that saw a lot of promise last season, but lacked sufficient protection was Caleb Williams, right, in Chicago. The Bears have been dominating the offseason, getting plenty of help on both the offensive and defensive lines. Might Chicago now be a contender for the postseason?
Yeah, I think so. And again, when we say contender, they'll be in the graphic that says in the hunt, and we'll get all excited about the Chicago Bears. I don't know how far that'll take them, but ultimately they're going to be a much better team than they were a year ago. What were their two biggest issues? One was inefficiency at the coaching staff. So we saw in that Thanksgiving Day game just poor in-game management. But go back to that game, that infamous game against the Commanders where they let up that Hail Mary. It was poor coaching even there. I don't think that's going to happen with Ben Johnson. And then they go into free agency, even before free agency, address their next biggest need, which was the offensive line. Caleb Williams was sacked, as you can see there, 68 times. That's absolutely ridiculous. It's 101 of how to break a generational number one pick quarterback. So what do? They go and do free agency. They sign Drew Dahlman to a really massive contract in terms of the center position. You go and trade for Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson. You're fixing that offensive line. So if you're telling me that Caleb Williams is going to have more protection, better protection, and he still has solid receiving weapons, this team could be frisky late in the year.
Last year I had a long shot, and I believe maybe we talked about this on the Pick Six podcast. I thought that maybe the Chicago Bears would win their division. Seems like maybe I was just a year too early, maybe a couple years too early on that one. But let's talk about the Bengals here. They've been fairly quiet in free agency despite some wide receiver contract talks. Obviously, they tagged T. Higgins. They've been trying to work out a deal with Jamar Chase. But Sully, they've got issues on defense that need to be addressed. Are you worried about them, or is this like, we got Joe Burrow, they can still be a playoff team?
Well, the answer is both, right? Like, I'm not worried about them because they have Joe Burrow. Again, that 5-0 run at the end of the season shows why you can never count out the Cincinnati Bengals, because you have just one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL in Joe Burrow. So whenever you have that, you can sleep a little bit easier, especially when you have Jamar Chase there too. But I am concerned about this team because this is an organization that we shouldn't even be talking about. Can they make the playoffs or not? It's should they be able to win the Super Bowl? But they're not even there yet because of, as you referenced, the defense is still a massive problem, and they haven't really done anything to address it. In fact, they're going to get worse because they're trying to keep the band back together on offense, which is Jamar Chase, which obviously you have to do. You have to make him the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL. But do you really need T. Higgins? I know you signed him to the franchise tag. He's a favorite of Joe Burrow. But when you have Joe Burrow, if you have those fringe number one, 1B wide receivers, you should be able to afford them to go and not at the expense of possibly, it seems like they're going to trade Trey Hendrickson, your number one pass rusher, your really only good defensive player. This was a defense last year that allowed opponents, when they got into the red zone, to score a touchdown basically on 69% of the trips. That's third worst in the NFL. That can't happen if they're trying to win a Super Bowl. And again, we're just talking about them merely making the playoffs.
Yeah, have to agree with you on that one. Let's talk about those Patriots. They had the most cap space going into free agency. And boy, Sully, have they made the most of it. They resigned some key players. They added some big-time players like Milton Williams and Matt Collins, the guy that never seems to wear any shoes. Is it too ambitious to call this a potential playoff team?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm biased up in New England. So, it was fun to see them go on that spending spree. But overall, I think that this is a step in the right direction, but not something that's going to catapult them to the postseason. Sure, there were some needs on this roster, particularly on the defensive side. You get better and the coaching staff by hiring Mike Vrabel. You bring in Josh McDaniels as the OC. They're going to be a better, much well-coached football team in 2025. But there's still some issues that this team needs to address. Again, we're just at the start of the new league year. Free agency has been only a couple of days. They still need a number one wide receiver. They still need a left tackle. These are legitimate issues to this team contending and getting back into the conversation of the playoffs. So yes, Milton Williams, great addition to a defense that was dead last in the NFL in sacks last season. But overall, this is one of the poorest, weakest, talented rosters in the NFL last year, so it needs a little bit more.
Tell us how you really feel about those Patriots. Lastly, the Jets officially released Aaron Rodgers today. No surprise. They said they were going to do as much. Justin Fields will take over as a signal caller with $30 million guaranteed. Sully, the expectations are not as high, right, as they were with Rodgers. But could this be a playoff team with Justin Fields?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I like the Justin Fields signing. I think, it reminds me, and you'll appreciate this, it reminds me of that Sunday morning when you put a bunch of legs together on a parlay. That kind of makes sense. You throw $10 on it and you can win like 200 grand. It's that generational wealth parlay. You're like, all right, if it hits, this is great. I'm going to the Caribbean. If it doesn't, I only lost $10. This is kind of what this feels like at the quarterback position, where Justin Fields has shown us a little bit at times, but still overall not the consistency that you want. Again, this is a quarterback that's 14-30 as a starter in his career, but he is still young. So if it hits, it's great. If not, you only sign him to a deal that has an average of $20 million per season. So again, it's interesting. It's low risk, but overall, I don't think this is something that's going to propel them to the playoffs.
I love that analogy because nothing feels better than just firing off on that parlay and you think, I am a genius and I'm going to be so rich. And then as the day goes on, there's always that one leg that will come back and bite you. Tyler Sullivan, as always, appreciate you.